Hello everyone, welcome back. My name is Abdullah Sajad and today we're going to do another video on STYLY. So today's purpose is, like I discussed in the previous video, we'll be creating another scene, and this time specifically we will be looking into the bow and arrow mechanism. Okay, so first of all we need two models. One of them is the arrow and the other one is the longbow. You can get them at any 3D model website. I got mine from 3D Warehouse. Simply download them and export them as FBX from SketchUp, and then simply drag them in here. So once we have both of these models, now we want to create prefabs out of them. They're models at the moment. To create a prefab, simply click and drag the model here and make it a child of an empty object, and then simply drag it back by change and make sure to change its name. I named it where is it, arrow prefab. So basically in the arrow prefab we have an arrow, and now it's a object, a prefab. So do the same with the long bow and create a bow prefab. Okay, so once we have the okay, so now that we're done with the bow part, let's just focus on the arrow part. So once we have the arrow prefab, we need to create two more prefabs. One is going to be the model of our controller, so I just named it arrow controller, and the other is going to be the arrow that actually flies off when we throw it or release it, if you may. So okay, so let's see how I made the arrow controller. Let me just drag it here. Okay, so the arrow controller has the arrow prefab which we previously created and a sphere which is going to be serving the purpose of a spawn point. So let's just name it spawn point as well. Spawn point. Okay, so whenever you make a change to a prefab, a model of a prefab, always click apply so that the changes here are saved in the prefab over here. So now you can see the name has changed as well. Okay, so this was just the controller part, and let's look into the arrow throwable. Okay, so what does it have? It has simply an arrow prefab, and I added an FSM state into it. So let's just work on that. Okay, so what is this arrow supposed to do? Basically, in a bow and arrow scenario, whenever you pull an arrow back, it's supposed to go forward, right? So the more you pull it back, the more force it would have and the farther it would travel when you release it. But you actually also need a reference point for the distance which you will be calculating for the arrow. Like how far is the arrow from the bow? That is going to be our main, you can say, way to find out the distance. We're going to be working with the distance of the bow and the arrow. That will be mimicking the real physics of how a bow and arrow works. So basically in the arrow we need two positions or two objects. One would be the reference of the right controller, which would be the arrow, and the other would be a variable for the bow. So what we're going to do is basically simply going to find game objects, two of them. One is going to be the right controller right, and the other is going to be the controller left. Let's just write it here. Right. Oh, right. The other is the controller left. So let's just save them in new variables. Let's call this controller R, This is going to be a new variable called controller L. Okay, so now that we have the distances, the objects, we need to find the distance. So let's just look for a distance action. Distance, get distance. Okay, so we can specify two objects here. So one is going to be L, controller left, and the other is going to be the controller right. Now we are okay, so we don't want to do this for every frame, so we're just going to uncheck that. We're going to store the value in a new variable. Let's call it distance. Okay, so now that we have the distance, we need to think up of an equation which will give us the resulting force. So basically we want the arrow to travel minimal distance when the two controllers are nearest to each other, and the maximum distance when they are far apart. So in my opinion, I am going to be using a simple multiplication. I am going to be multiplying a simple constant with this distance. So basically, if the distance is 0, the arrow is not going to travel anywhere. And if the distance is, let's say, 1 or 2, it's simply going to multiply it with a constant, and we're going to get a force which we are going to add into it. So let's get on with it. We have the distance, and let's just get a float multiplier, float multiply. Okay, so another thing, like I have told in the previous tutorials, always keep the flow from up to down. Okay, so we have a constant. We can just write, let's see, I would go with 300, just trying it. Okay, so what's the float variable we want to give store the result in? So let's just keep it simple, and you need to multiply it with distance. For your information, 300 is going to be multiplied with distance, and the resultant is also going to be stored in distance. So yeah, there are a few things which we cannot do anything about. I would have created a new variable, but let's just make do. So we have the distance, the force actually in the distance variable. So we're going to add force. Okay, so it says that you need to attach a rigid body to it. So simply we're going to drag it back here, and inspector, add component, rigid body, and there we go. Okay, so always remember to apply the changes. Now when we look it up, yes. Okay, so simply drag it down, add force. We are going to be adding the force to this very object, and like we did in other tutorials, we're going to be adding the force in the Z variable and in the self space. So basically what this would do is, even if the space was kept world, then wherever we move the controller, the arrow would have traveled in the world's Z direction. But we want the arrow to have a different space according to the controller. So wherever the controller is pointed, we want the arrow to move in that direction for the moment, even though it doesn't work like that in the actual scenario. Okay, so now that all of the setup is done, I believe, we also need to, since we're using the distance variable, and I really don't know how Playmaker works, but I would like to um, clear it. So set float, is there something? Set animator float, set float value. Okay, so what is the variable we're talking about? Distance, and we're just going to set it 0. So whenever we another variable prefab is created, well, I guess we don't need this, but I've done it anyways. Okay, so now that we have this, let's look into the playmaker controller settings we have previously created. So we have the right controller, we have the left controller, we have the setup. So in the setup, basically in STYLY there is a default plane, and it would not allow so it would basically block the rigid bodies. So we're simply just going to find it and destroy it. Make sure you use these spellings. Okay, so in the right controller, which was basically a copy, okay, so the left controller is basically a copy of the right controller without these two states. In the left controller, basically we're just deleting the previous model and replacing it with the bow model. And in the right controller over here, we're simply replacing it with the arrow controller. In state 1, we're doing nothing, waiting for the trigger up. Hey, okay, so I guess this is not right. This is supposed to be down, and this is supposed to be up. Okay, so now that we have done change this, okay, so in the state 2 we need to get the rotation of the controller. Let's go through it. We are basically getting the spawn point for item, and we are getting the spawn point rotation, and then we are finding the game object controller left. Okay, so we know we don't need this, I guess. Yes, remove, and we don't need this as well. So we just need to get the rotation, and we need to create the object. Let me just make one thing sure. You're getting the child and spawn point. Okay, yeah. Okay, so everything is set up now. So whenever we create this object, we are going to be creating a arrow throwable, and we are simply going to add force, and it would fly off. So yeah, everything's done. So we're simply going to upload this model onto STYLY. So once I've uploaded it, I am going to add it into the STYLY scene, and then I'm just simply going to skip forward to the actual demonstration. So let's see you then. So yeah, let's test this out. Okay, so the first thing I am noticing is that the arrow is actually not the way it should be. The bow is okay, but the arrow is totally, we should just rotate it at 180 degrees, as you can see. Okay, so the other thing is the mechanics. As you can see, they work, but the multiplier is not great enough. We need to move it up a bit. We'll just see that. Okay, so as you can see, this works. I'm simply going to wait a minute. um let's see, where did it go? Yes, so for the arrow throwable, let's change it from here. Arrow throwable, the float multiplier. So instead of 300, we'll just move this up to what's an interesting number, 2000. Okay, so That's all we need to do, and the other thing is we just need to rotate the arrow prefab and we are done. So as you can see, this isn't really that hard. All you need to do is you need to have the creativity and you need to have a basic knowledge of physics and mathematics to get whatever you want to done. So let's see what I can come up with in the next tutorial, and